There we go. So I will get us started. I'm Amy Harrigan. I'm the director of the Sape office at the University of South Carolina, and really excited to have y'all for our Carolina Community Coalition meeting for April. So excited to have joining us today Tom Fontana from the University of Vermont. I will read his bio and then we'll have some great conversation. Tom Fontana coordinates the drug and alcohol education at the University of Vermont. He oversees the Basics program, which is a brief intervention model, and meets with student groups, including fraternities, sororities, and athletics. He is also a member of UVM's CHIP team, which helps steer AOD policy on campus. Tom is the author of the Tea Break Guide, a free resource to help people take a tolerance break from cannabis. And I'm so excited for y'all to hear about that because we've been using it here on campus and I think it's just great. He's the principal investigator of research studies seeking to gauge the effectiveness of cannabis harm reduction resources. So with that said, Tom, I will let you go ahead and take it away. And like I said, if folks have questions, pop them in the Q&A and we will answer them.
Yeah, please, put the questions in there at any point. Also feel free to unmute and just ask at any point. And what I'm going to try to do is wrap up a presentation-y type thing, certainly within half an hour, and leave a lot of time for discussion. But ask questions at any point, please. Hey, Amy, thanks for the invitation to be here and the opportunity. I was just telling you offline, but I want to reiterate for everyone. I really appreciated this series you've put together, the kind of the research series for the Carolina Coalition, and making those available online. I just accessed Dr. Berry's presentation from, I think it was in the fall he came, talked about game day and drinking. It was just really helpful to see and do that. Thanks for allowing me to be part of this series too. So hi, everybody. Yeah, this is gonna be great. We'll talk about cannabis, talk about the idea of tolerance breaks, and that's what we'll do. I think, oh yeah, there are, so I just saw a question pop up in the thing about tea break guides, and they are available in print. We have two forms of a PDF online, and you can print them out as long as you have a double-sided printer in a kind of little booklety type shape. And then students report really liking having the physical guide because it's kind of low tech. They can check it off and it acts as a reminder. But I'm like, yeah, let me go ahead. I guess I'll share my screen and we'll do all of that action. And I'll just go through a little bit of some prepared slides for you, and then we can get into discussion. But like I said, let's discuss at any point too. Yeah. So the idea of time for a tolerance break. I think it is time that we know the concept and really look at it. We've had some cool research that looks at how this helps people and how we might introduce it to them. And I'll share that with you in just a little bit. I figure, just as a brief outline, I do always like to start with some context around cannabis because a lot of us might be coming from different places. South Carolina, I think a long time bill has moved out of the Senate. The House is taking it up right now and for a medicinal look. And so it's an ever evolving landscape. Just want to put a little context to that. Because we're in a college setting, I just want to look at its impact on academics. I think there's some interesting and good research just to be aware of on that. We can look quickly at just some updated data usage that we know about, and then get into the idea of tolerance breaks. Just go through a little bit of the research and the outcome, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the design of the guide so you know a little bit more. And then just one or two ways we might engage students specifically, then we'll move into questions if that seems good with people. For the context, I think it's helpful to remember in the 90s, everywhere in the country, it was prohibited on all levels. It just wasn't allowed anywhere, and it's just what it was. But it changed around 2000. The first state started allowing medicinal cannabis and decriminalizing one or two of those two things. That idea spread to more states and more states again. And that was kind of the state of things approaching about 2010, kind of this growing idea of medical marijuana, which your state is taking up right now, the conversation about, or South Carolina is. And I actually don't know if everyone's from South Carolina. I just wanted to, this idea of potency that you've likely heard about. Perhaps you've seen these charts of that, back in the 60s and 70s, it was very low, 2, 3, 4% THC. Now it's routinely in the 20s. People would dismiss, if they had weed right now that was about 15% THC, they would call that mids right now. That would kind of be an insult to call somebody's weed mid. It's like, but 15% THC would blow people's minds even a decade ago. So just that kind of change is incredible, and how that's happened. So it's just important to keep in mind that potency's gone up. Part of that is because of this legalization. It brings an industry to it, which brings the ability to scale things up. It's allowed communications around strains and breeding and money to come into the idea of really pushing this product. There's probably an upper edge to which the flower THC can have the flower cannabis can have THC. That's about 33%. You can't really put more into the flower, but you can make concentrates and other things like we already have that go way up. The problem with all that potency is this idea of tolerance. And that's, I think, the main theme throughout what we'll talk about today. And I think really one of the easiest ways to engage people, because it's a very low barrier thing. It's not stigmatized. It is just a reality, a chemical reality of the drug and our reactions to any substances. And it's a way to really engage people, even if they feel like the substance is helping them or they like it a lot for other reasons. Tolerance is still real. And so it's a way to talk about people. How do you balance your cannabis? So we'll certainly come back around to this. But here's a chart. This is just some random thing off the internet from, as so much of our information comes from the cannabis industry itself. This is a vaguely seemingly scientific thing that I could find no references for. I don't even know what it exactly means, but it's pretty. And it seems to suggest that cannabis really helps with all of these things. So somewhere around 2010 and beyond, it moved from this idea of medicinal cannabis to cannabis actually being pro-health, right? Medicinal being, hey, something's wrong with you, this could help with it. This is like, even if nothing's wrong with you, cannabis can help with it. And so this movement's really come about, and I think that's where we sit in terms of context often. Not everyone feels that way, but that's kind of what's promoted. And this chart just showing any of these things, seemingly, it seems to be suggesting that cannabis can help you with these. It's just so misleading and confusing to people to suggest all of these things, when in fact, my kids just got home, of course, and so you might hear that family noise in the background. Glad to have them home. But what we'll be seeing here is that it was a big week for South Carolina Gamecocks, and congratulations on the national basketball title and win. That's super exciting for a school. It's also been a big week in the world of drug and alcohol research. There was a really big article around alcohol. I'm not referencing it here, but just to be aware of, that concluded no amount of alcohol is good for your heart. We've had this open, we know it's never good for your liver, but there's been this open debate for 2 decades of just some amount good, does it thin your blood? This one said no, nothing helps with it. So I don't know that'll end the debate, but that's a milestone article and really changes how a lot of doctors are beginning to talk about that. A big one came out also just this week from Gilman and Schussler out at Harvard, and looked at medical marijuana. And they basically, you can't tell, they took 2 groups and they asked one group, they randomly selected them. It was a randomized control trial, right, which is the gold standard. We haven't had many of these around cannabis. We've only had these kind of meta-analysis. So this is a randomized control trial. They asked one group to delay 2 months getting their medical card. The other group got it right away. And they showed that the people got it right away resulted in no significant improvement in pain, anxiety, or depressive symptoms. It did seem to help with their sleep quality, but it seemed to just really increase the likelihood of cannabis use disorder. So this is really something we need to discuss and look at as a field to really understand what is the framework for medicinal cannabis. And this really is suggesting that it's probably not all things to all people. Let me just put a quick context on the academic piece, just to think about that, because that is our setting here. We are unclear of where cannabis exists medically. I don't want to dismiss it. It seems people There are people who say it really helps, and we do not want to dismiss that. We simply do not know what it's helping with and for whom, and we need to know that medically. It's not medicine if we're just like, try it. I think try it for however long you want and do it whenever you want. And let's see, that's not really how we've done medicine before. But we do know with academics, we're pretty clear that frequent use definitely impacts academic outcomes. A couple big articles about that. And so I'll certainly make this available to anybody. You can catch the links right here and take a look at that. But what we see pretty quickly is, let me just close the door to the room here real quick. Sorry, y'all. Let me just close as I'm presenting y'all. Yep. Just family stuff, Got my dog here with me though still. These are important articles, and you see a lot of them. Dr. Aria's work at University of Maryland, the college life study, is probably really helpful conceptualizing this because she was able to do a cohort study. She got money to follow a group and then followed them for 10 years. And I think one of the most readable versions is this kind of report that they put out almost 10 years ago now. And it talked about the opportunity costs of using cannabis. That an opportunity cost, right? That economic term of choosing one thing over another. And certainly when you're doing drugs, you're not doing something else sometimes. You're putting time and money into something. And just this idea that it has a way of really interfering with a student's ability to engage with all things that the college has to offer. When a student tells you that they use cannabis daily, they sometimes will quickly warn you, oh, it's after I get my work done. And so there are people certainly used throughout the day, but many are waiting until the evening or some other time. But the evening is also when college life really happens. Clubs are meeting, office hours can be happening. There's a lot of vibrancy on a college campus in the evening. And if you're in your room choosing one thing, you might not be participating in those others. This highlights that pretty well. Data, just an update on kind of where we're at. Use cannabis. This is Kilmer, our colleague at the University of Washington, Jason Kilmer, who does great work. Just put this out 2 weeks ago. So again, a big week in research for cannabis and other drugs. The conclusion, I mean, he felt like he had to say it, though it's obvious. And he's like, okay, let me just go ahead and research it. Make that, yeah, when you legalize it, use goes up. The industry tries to suggest that that's not the case. There are always little things you see. Does use rate go up when we legalize it? No. Clearly it does. This article is actually a research article instead of an opinion piece that shows, yes, when we make it more accessible and more available, rates go up. Also, we have the same data from the National Collegiate Health, the American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment, ACHA's NCHA survey. This is our most recent from spring 2021. They released the data in December. Big 70,000 person study. So it might not exactly relate to your school, but it's probably our best national look at it. As we know, alcohol continues to be the #1 substance, but the amount of students coming in and not having used it is going up. So alcohol in some ways is on the decrease. Cannabis, with some big distance between it, is #2, but above nicotine. We also see that cannabis is on its way up though. Nicotine was going down, right? For years, we were doing great. The Juul kind of fucked that up in vaping, and now we see that coming back down again, luckily. But what's the fourth most used? This is interesting. If you want to make any guesses in the chat or in your head, I'm sorry, I can't kind of see the chat. So actually, sorry, if you're putting questions in the chat, my bad, I don't see them. But Amy, maybe you could read them or anybody can. But the fourth most, and we were like, oh, is it stimulants? Is it going to be cocaine? Which things is it going to be? Hallucinogens, the only other one to crack double digits. This is on the increase as well. And if you wouldn't, I'd be happy. Another time, I think we need more talk and conversations around hallucinogens. We need to be more prepared for those conversations as a side note. But
the two guesses in the chat were caffeine and prescriptions.
Oh, 100%.
So,
caffeine is really, if we were looking, caffeine's the #1 most widely used every time around. And it's funny, we don't usually do that. We have prescription stimulants, and it's kind of like prescription opiates, and those went down. Stimulants are still there, and then hallucinogens jumped over them. But that was probably the 5th one. I think when talking about cannabis, it is important to remember, this shows us from the survey, when they asked the lifetime use question, about 60% of people said they've never even used it. So it's still true that the majority of our college students Depending on your campus, it might be a little lower or higher than that, but in the national sample, yeah, 60% still haven't even used it in their life. And then the next question of the people who've used it in the last 3 months, how often have you used it? And of the people who even ever used it, most haven't even done it in the last 3 months. So it's true, most people are not using cannabis at all or very frequently. But the next most common group is doing it a lot. And that's an important, this shape of this bar graph, every other drug, with just a few, most drugs go down in a parabolic sense. Most people haven't done it. Most people haven't done it recently. Decreases, 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 decreases. Alcohol is the exception and makes a bell curve. When we ask how often do you drink in the last month, some say never, some say a lot, but it's usually 1, 2, 3 days a week, which bubbles it up. Cannabis and nicotine are the only 2 drugs with this reverse curve. The reverse meaning that, yes, still most people don't do it, but more people do it daily than weekly or monthly. That's something to pay attention to, the frequent use of this. Although more people use alcohol than cannabis on this survey and in our country as we measure it, more people use cannabis daily than drink alcohol daily. So that's about 4 times as much used of people who use it, use cannabis daily. So that's where I think this key piece is. We always want to focus on prevention. We always want to support recovery. When we look at intervention and use, it's the misuse where I think we're best served to focus our attention. This kind of frequency usually described as 20 or more days a month, so daily or near daily. All right, just to jump into the tolerant breaks conference concept, and then we're moving along here and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. I think it's always this question of how do we engage students in this conversation around use when they sometimes, if they're coming to us wanting to stop, then it's easy. They got that motivation, they're in a different stage of change, but how do we engage people who are just not in that spot? The tolerance break guide is designed to be this idea of just in the self-help sense of like, hey, at your own pace, consider this. On the left, you'll see we kind of lay it out. It's a 21-day break is what we're inviting people to do, 3 weeks. In the first week, we focus on what the physical experience likely is during that time of, frankly, withdrawal or just stopping. That second week really gets into the emotional experience. And then the third week is this kind of spiritual, existential idea of connection and other things. Here's the front of the guide, and then the back of the guide is the checklist. Here's where it comes from. It actually comes from conversations with students. They're telling me what works and what doesn't work. And so I laid it out this way and wrote it out, but it fits with what we also know within the DSM. Here's the DSM diagnostic criteria in part B of what they ask for around cannabis use disorder. Person would need to display 3 or more of the following: irritability, anxiety, sleep, appetite, restlessness, mood, or the physical symptoms here. To see that they're paired up, this is what we really try to address in the first 2 weeks of this experience for people, because this is what they're going through initially as they stop a substance they were using more frequently. So it wasn't designed because of the DSM, but it is in line with what it suggests will come up for people. But you'll see that it's not in that third week. And there's this question here of how would students respond to this third week. This is where this idea comes from. There's really great wisdom. If you want wisdom about a drug, don't just ask the people doing it. Ask the people who were doing it a lot and then stopped doing it, sometimes known as recovery, right? That those folks have a lot of perspective. Certainly can have perspective doing it, but you're often, pretty focused on the doing it. Folks in recovery have a lot of perspective, and the Marijuana Anonymous, which is a group that has a lot of insights, certainly, and a lot of wisdom about the experience, has this great thing called their 12 questions, something somebody can ask themselves to help determine if cannabis is a problem in their life. And it's so much more nuanced to me than when I look at the QDIP, for example. The audit is great, our best measure of alcohol screening. cute it feels like we just swapped out the word alcohol and threw in the word cannabis, which we pretty much did. And I don't know that that's the best measure of a substance that's different. These have these insightful comments. Do you get anxious when your stash is running low? Do you get high alone, which is an important one? And we see that with drinking too, but has it stopped being fun for you? And so these questions show up more in this third week of is it this big part of your friendship? Where are your connections, right? Where is it hard for you to imagine your life without this? And so we really try to address these things around connection and other topics. And interestingly, students have said, hey, certainly I appreciated that help the first couple of days reading the guide. And frankly, they're like, I read through the whole thing and it was good to know that right off the bat. But really, as I was getting there in week 3, I really got something. Not all of them, but many might say I really got something out of that third week. So that's interesting to see. Here's some of that data of that. So thanks to the Vermont Department of Health, we got a grant to look at the guide and measure it. It's just a pilot study, but we were able to recruit 125 students. It took me like months to get approval, going through IRB when it's cannabis. I'm like, but they're not doing cannabis. I'm asking them not to do cannabis, but still was plenty of hurdles to jump. We got approval in the very last week of school. And I was like, come on, how are we going to get students to sign up? Turns out students will do anything for $10 at the end of a semester. So it was a great time to recruit. They were like, I'll give you my liver. I'm like, that's a different study. We're just asking you not to smoke weed. We were able to recruit 125 cannabis users on our campus and 8 other campuses who were current users and who were willing to take a 21-day break. This wasn't a randomized control trial. They weren't assigned. So I should note that. They were just self-selected. Hey, we said, there's a guide that exists. Feel free to use it. Here's the link, or don't. If you want a physical one, we'll mail it to you. Let us know. And so, or print it out, whatever you want to do. We then had some measures. 30 days later, we followed up with them after they took the baseline survey. Then they were asked to start the 21-day break. We asked if they completed the break. Have they used since it ended? What's their confidence in doing a break in the future? About your personal definition of balance or your cannabis use, about other drugs during the break. And we sorted it by how much they used the guide. There were people who said they used it none. Some said, no, I feel plenty confident I didn't need it. Others said, oh, I didn't even know there was a guide. That's my bad, probably a study design thing. Should have made it a little more clear to them. But nonetheless, there was a group who said none and basically acts as a control group then. There was a group who said they used it some. Yeah, I looked at it and, not so frequent. And then a lot who said used it most days or every day. And we sorted the outcomes by that. The a lot versus none, all people were more likely to complete the 21-day break of 84 to 54. They were about 3 times more likely to folks who use the guide a lot to be planning a future break. Their personal definition had evolved to mean less cannabis. This was a big one. They reported that they didn't see themselves using cannabis 3 years into the future, was significantly more people who were using the guide a lot, and certainly in terms of saying it was worth it. But this interesting one too, we were worried about, will people just replace other drugs when they're taking a break for cannabis? And overall, no, they were not. And folks, for whatever reason, using the guide were not. This is something we need to explore why that's the case. But overall, I think it's a good message that tolerance breaks themselves are useful. That people tend to use it as an overall health break. They take breaks from other things. They use it to reevaluate. In nicotine literature, they call it a practice quit attempt, right? We're not trying to trick people into quitting. They might only want to stop if they want to stop, but it turns out that other people, once they went 3 weeks, they're like, I kind of like how I'm feeling. And so that amount of people, wait, did I include that one? The people who were, there was a good percentage of people, sorry, I don't think I linked it. A good percentage of people who 30 days later still weren't using cannabis. So it's not like at the 21st day, they just had their stash waiting there. No, they said it worked. Either if they returned, they were using less, or even some of them 30 days later still weren't using. And so it was not meant to be a trick to say, oh, do this. But for some, they like the way they feel. I'll just lastly put this little point about one thing around engaging students, because I think it's a way that we can use it well. We can't just, just because someone's using cannabis, throw a guide at them, or just any intervention or anything, can't just say, oh, go, we have to engage them in what they want to get out of the topic, as motivational interviewing would remind us has to be the case. I can come back to, I think there's this idea of loyalty, to sum up this slide quickly. I could go on forever about it, but it's just that students are loyal in different ways to different drugs. And we can't say all students are the same, but generally alcohol is kind of in the middle, right? There's things, loyalty being this idea of our willingness to attribute negatives and positives to it. I tell more stories, but let me just move on. But basically, generally students are pretty loyal to cannabis. They tend not to see it have negative effects. If there's negative effects that happen, they tend to say, oh, that's, oh, you didn't do good in that class. You're smoking a lot of weed, probably because the class was boring. Oh, you didn't do, they assign it to something else. And so we have to be thoughtful when approaching something that somebody is more loyal to or more protective of. And there might be reasons they're loyal to it. Maybe they also feel like it helps in their lives, but it just means we need a slightly different approach than something they're already likely, like nicotine. Sometimes, like even smokers, like, fuck, I gotta smoke less cigarettes, like it sucks. And so you can have a little bit different conversation with them about when they're already in that place of wanting to change. Right. The sleep cycle, I think, is a useful way to engage students on this topic. And just because this is kind of slide based, let me share these two, and then we'll be done, because it's helpful to have the visual. We know that cannabis doesn't affect sleeps. In fact, the Harvard study coming out this week shows the one thing that it really seemed to do was help people fall asleep. And we know that to be the case. We dream, well, we sleep in stages, 90-minute cycles, and we dream at the top of our cycles, usually 5 to 7 minutes every 90 minutes. We go up and down. There's kind of deep sleep, which is physically restorative, and light sleep, which is mentally restorative, because it's when we dream. We think dreaming right is when we consolidate short-term memory into long-term. That creates a little more focus and concentration the next day as we clear out our short-term memory. What happens with cannabis is that people fall asleep quicker, and with alcohol too, the same would be the case. But with cannabis, they stay in deep sleep all night. Physically, that's fairly restorative. It is a good quality sleep in terms of sometimes that restlessness and falling asleep. The challenge is that you then would miss your REM cycles. If you never smoke weed and you smoke weed once before bed, you would miss your REM cycles. Well, if you start smoking consistently, you can't go more than 48 hours without having REM cycles. So your brain will go into this REM rebound. And the very first thing you'll do is catch some REM sleep as you go into sleep, but it really disrupts your REM. That's the challenge. And I'll show you why in a second. But when we ask students, this comes from the NCHA, the National College Health Assessment we were looking at earlier. They asked this list of, hey, here's some things. What of these get in the way of your academic success? And we say, what about drugs? What about drinking? No, very low on the list. It's beneath homesickness. Students who identify homesickness as getting more in the way, and that's a real thing. I don't mean to laugh. I'm just saying, like drinking, drugs, like no, not getting in the way. What are the things college students would say? I saw a couple of people from CAPS, right? What are you hearing? Always going to be anxiety, sleep difficulties, and stress. Those are very real things. Here's the challenge. If students tell us that the top 3 things that they feel anxiety or create academic stress, or to get in the way of academic success is stress, anxiety, and being tired. Some of them might be like, well, then weed's great for these. Helps me fall asleep, helps with my anxiety, helps with my stress. And then they're like, okay, I'll do my work. There's always this hand, but like, don't worry, man, I get my work done. And then I'll smoke before bed. So it'll be great. Well, we know that smoking before bed, or I should say partaking, because it could be edibles, could be vaping and dabbing, contributes to REM deprivation. What are the 3 effects of REM deprivation? They are irritability, anxiety, and daytime sleepiness. And so the very challenge of the thing that people feel like helps them the most, oh, weed's helping with these things, and in the moment it helps you fall asleep, but it goes to what students would generally describe as a cloudiness or a fogginess the next day. And sometimes when you're in this cycle, you can't but it's helping you fall asleep, and not falling asleep's the worst. So you do it anyway. And it was fun to chill with your friends at the end of the day, and you like the reward of it and these different things. But you're in this cycle and you're feeling a little cloudy. And then finally, when somebody takes a tea break, I'm holding up the guide as if that's the only way. You can just pause. There's lots of ways to just take a tea break. But sometimes they come out of that fog and they're feeling much better. And that's why they might want to keep it going. So just introducing to students this idea that the challenge is that it helps perhaps in the moment. For some people, it doesn't help at all. It makes them more anxious and they're not likely to do it. But for those that it does help, it is at best momentary. And even that ability for it to help in the moment decreases with tolerance. So the last thing I'll just say, and then we'll get into it, the question, if a student tells me that weed helps them, motivational interviewing tells us 1,000 reasons why we do not want to tell them, no, it doesn't. Here's an article by, like, nope, I'm glad they found something. And I'll sincerely say it, I'm glad they found something. My question is, how then can we keep it being a thing that's useful to you? How then, because you also deserve this, can we work on the stuff that is bothering you in the first place that this is helping with, so that that's reduced, right? And so how can we get other skills in your life besides cannabis? Because what we know is cannabis tolerance is going to decrease the ability of this to keep helping you. So I'm glad you have this. How can we keep it good in your life? How can we help with these other things? And students tend to be open to that. So I'll hop out of the chat or the video. Oh, see ya. I'm not gonna hop out of the chat right now. I'm just gonna, stop the video and let's get students, hop on in, or just anybody. What are people thinking about, or where you at?
Thank you so much, Tom. I really appreciate all the things that you have to say. I'm going to sit here and promote a couple of folks to panelists. If I can figure out our Zoom things here so that they can ask questions for you. But if anyone else has questions, you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get started. And I see some hands raised. We have questions in the chat. We got good things happening. So,
and I'm just hearing this question about microdosing that Christina threw in there. And I'm happy to address it quickly here, but it really is worth its whole topic. But just so people understand this concept, because microdosing is a word we should be aware of, in a concept. I mean, we can know the word, but the concept is really what we want to grasp. That is particular to psychedelics, but it actually can be used in a lot of contexts. Microdosing is the idea of using, generally the thought is about a tenth, but it's a fraction of a dose that would otherwise impair you, but using it regularly. And so the thought is, psychedelics give me this experience. Microdosing, some people with really chronic depression or other experiences feel like this idea of microdosing helps them. And we don't want to dismiss this. In fact, the FDA is not dismissing it, nor they have fast-tracked psychedelics as a breakthrough therapy for these, and they're in their final stage 3 clinical trials. And so that's why we'll be hearing more about it and seeing there is a lot of potential. But it's not just tripping that's immediately going to cure things for you. It's within a context of working with a provider and processing those experiences. So I think that's where we need to be prepared to talk about students. But the idea of microdosing is using a smaller amount. And it is possible also with edibles to bring this back. You generally wouldn't microdose from a bong or from I'll just take 2 hits and store this joint for later. But what you could do is microdose cannabis through just a small amount of edibles. So usually you do that through, so there are people who could just keep an amount in their system. And Caroline asked, just what's that difference between decriminalized and legalized? For sure, because these are happening in states. Usually it'll depend on the state and what they decide those changes are. But the idea of decriminalizing is simply removing literally we have civil system in our country and a criminal system, both of which you can be in trouble, but your traffic ticket is civil and you're punching someone in the face is criminal, or not when you slap them on stage somewhere, depending how we view that. And Will was close to my heart. I love that man. But anyway, let me not go that direction. That was a can of worms I should not. Let me just close that up. Didn't happen. the idea with the decriminalizing is that we are just no longer moving these fines through our court system. And there's usually an amount. It's like, oh, if you have below some amount of ounces or something like that. The legalization is that retail market, that ability to consume, to buy, and to sell that comes online. So you can decriminalize without allowing it. You just are saying, but if you're caught with small, lesser amounts, you're just going to get a ticket.
And that is our law in South Carolina. So as long as you're in possession of a small amount, then your consequences are fairly minimal. You write a ticket, you pay your fine, but it's not a prolonged process without a larger quantity. So Eilish and Emily, would either of you like to start us off and introduce yourself and ask a question?
Can I go
Emily?
first? My child is crying and I don't know how long that'll sustain. So I'm Emily. I'm in the office of Sape as well. Thank you, Tom, for joining us. This is wonderful. So one of the things that we do at the University of South Carolina for alcohol is we have this slogan cups as like a harm reduction technique that when you're out with people and they're doing alcohol, here are like ways for us to be more responsible. And it's, looking for symptoms of overusage, right? I'm trying to think, is it possible for a program to come up with something to pair with the tea break guide? So the tea break guide is how to, take this break and, do harm reduction on that end. But when you're using,
yes,
like there's you were just mentioning microdosing, but that's really difficult to do with all these different formats. But if you're out, like could we, like from your experience in working in this area, is there a partnering harm reduction approach that we could use for people who are in the midst of using to also do harm reduction?
Yeah, I think there is, and there's a kind of growing consensus, but not yet. It took us decades to come up with safe guidelines for alcohol use. And prohibition ended a while ago, 80 years ago, and it took us about 80, maybe 10 years ago, we came up with, oh, look, we got safe guidelines. So it's going to take us a while with cannabis, particularly because the serving sizes are not standard, and that's a real challenge. However, some guidelines simply are, look at the way in which you're partaking. Inhaling burning plant matter is always more harmful than it's, I hate to say that, but vaping has its own real challenges. So I don't want to, vaping's again, no, now you're inhaling hot moisture into your lungs, and that's not awesome either. But to go from burning something to heating it through vaping to doing it as an edible, there are different and safer ways for our lungs. So thinking about your lungs is one way to think about safety. The other is thinking about the format of just kind of, as people move to edibles, knowing about dosing sizes. And that has really thrown that's hard for people to get right. And we've seen an increase in hospitalizations because of that. So I think there's a bit of education we could do around dosing size for people, helping them think about their method, certainly the not impaired driving piece, because it's still such I drive better. So you don't. So I think there's those pieces that we can do, but we just know better, literally with the alcohol, kind of like alternate with water, or use it, don't. But this part's true. Taking shots is a little harder than when you consume something bigger and bubblier, simply for this idea of titration. Titration is our ability to monitor kind of how much we're intaking. Problem with shots is you can throw 5 back so quickly. People can certainly shotgun 5 beers. I'm not saying it's never happened, but it's just a lot of bubbles and it's a lot of quantity that tends to slow people down. So we know that that's concentrated forms are more dangerous than less concentrated forms. That part's true for cannabis as well. So, to move people into lower amounts, this idea of there is language in both that also comes from psychedelics, but is true here, and you hear it with edibles. Go slow and start low is language for harm reduction language we can use for people using in the moment. Yeah, thank you for the question. And it doesn't sound like your kid's crying yet, or maybe you just had
I muted for that.
When they're teenagers, they still cry, believe me. But they mostly come home and stomp around. They just it's like my daughter doesn't have knees. Like she just bang, bang, bang. I'm like, wow, You're the loudest person I've ever. Okay, anyway.
Oh, thank you so much. I
I'm sure she's
appreciate
got
it.
complaints about me. So it's not, anyway, yeah.
And
Thank
I
you.
did throw the Canada's low risk use guidelines for cannabis in the chat. If anybody wants to take a look at those, because I think our neighbors to the north have done a decent job of putting together how long to wait to drive and things where you should avoid use and some other things that are probably the starting place for
Yeah.
some of those harm reduction messages that we need to get out. So thanks for that. Eilish.
Hi, so I also work for the Sape office. I am a grad assistant with Emily. So a lot of what I do is the same harm reduction kind of thing. We've been really on top of doing this kind of talk about it Tuesdays. So with our students, where we're trying to more, I would say, like normalize conversations with each other about just, crazy stuff and like relate it to how they can talk about more serious conversations or like, how to talk to their friends about, hey, I'm not partaking tonight or I'm not partaking for 3 weeks in the case of like tea breaks and stuff like that. So we've been doing silly stuff like asking if they could only be, or I think the last one we did was, if you had to be trapped in one country, where would it be and why? And so students would come up and like kind of talk to each other. Well, why would you want to go there? Like, wouldn't you rather go to, France or Sweden or whatever? And so we were kind of trying to talk to them about how they could say like, hey, if you have the confidence to talk to some stranger today about, where you would want to be stranded at, like you can go talk to your friends about, hey, I don't really want to drink tonight. I don't really want to go like smoke tonight, or, I'm doing this break. Like you should be able to talk to and normalize like talking to your friends about those kinds of things. I guess kind of my question is like, how would you suggest like continuing that conversation and like more normalizing like these tea breaks and things like that, like to students on campus?
Yeah, I appreciate, the work you're doing and the talk about it Tuesday. And I was talking about with Amy that, it fits with this story I sometimes tell, that idea of kind of two freshmen trying to meet each other, right? And if it's just like, one's like, oh, you seem to like talking, I like talking, let's walk in the woods at night and talk to each other, that's creepy. But if you're like, oh, hey man, do you like weed? I like weed, like let's go in the woods and smoke, like that becomes normal. And so we're up against this challenge of that these become a way that people can socialize, as you framed out. So it's awesome that you're looking at this work. I think what is cool that the tea break is something that's known as you can be like, not the guidance, but just, no, I'm taking a break. But it does seem, students, that they need to have a reason to tell their friends that they're not using for a period of time. And so saying I'm taking a tea break is good. But if they just were going to not do it, that their friends would actually have a lot of questions about it. And it's actually slightly different than with alcohol, whereas at least if you drink hard one night and the next night you're like, yo, I'll go out with y'all, but I'm not drinking. Like, why not? You're like, bro, you saw me last night, right? And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Like, they actually get that. Or you're like, yeah, man, I looked at my bank statement this morning. I was cashed out. I'm just not drinking. They'll get that. But if you say those same things with cannabis, it won't quite work because they don't feel like the overdose is as strong as. So if you're like, oh, I'm just not smoking, they're like, wait, what? Like, I don't get it. Or if you're like, I just don't have the money right now, like, yo, I'll smoke you up. Like, I got you. And so it is harder, students report, to just not do it for a reason. And I am literally I'm always, what do you say to your friend when you're not doing it? How do you do it? And this is part of the reason students, it is very hard for them to change their behavior during the semester because they are in these patterns where it's like, they call it, a cipher, a smoke circle, where you have a group and it's the rules are still the same for decades. It's puff, puff, pass, 2 hits, pass it to your left. and they get in a cipher with friends and they don't want to miss out on the cipher. They literally have a place, and you'll fuck up the smoke circle if you're not there. Your friends will be, whoa, where were you, man? I had to lean over to, hey, I need you on the couch. So like, students report that it's hard. And I don't, know, I'm still listening for like, hey, how have you done it? But saying I'm taking a tea break right now seems to be respected in the community of like, all right, cool, like sit with us and just pass it along. Others, I'm still listening for those answers from students, and they're struggling with them too.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Good response. I like that.
No, but I think it gives us insight in terms of our work that leading up to winter break, leading up to summer break, are these moments where we can start, hey, maybe it's hard at this moment to plan your tea break or to do something, but like, I think it gives us an insight that they feel more open to change during breaks in their schedule. So that can give us seeds to when we want to plan for those steps with them.
Tom, we have been collecting questions anonymously from students at some of these events in the last few weeks. And one of the questions that came up quite a few times is this idea of overdose, or what does too much look like? How do I tell if my friend needs help when it comes to cannabis? Because I think they know those symptoms for other types of overdose that might be more life-threatening. So what can you tell us about that for weed?
Yeah, and because it is, you can absolutely overdose, but there is this idea of like, one, maybe that you can't, but more likely, there's certainly the idea of like, oh, no one's ever died from too much cannabis. And it's fair, look, it's fair to say it is a far less potent thing than other substances. And that's good. We don't want things to be more potent. We don't want, fentanyl is killing so many people, even out, so yes, it tends to be that death is not the outcome of smoking too much weed. However, there is absolutely overdose, and our assumption that it's never killed anyone is based on an entirely different set of cannabis than we have now. We now have potency that's going up. We have this 100%, and even 100% THC, that alone, you can take a couple of hits, not killing people either. So I'm not trying to raise a lot. I'm just saying we don't know what those outcomes are, but it is more able to achieve overdose with potency. And students sometimes call this greening out, the idea. And I think it's, that idea of blacking out for alcohol, greening out with cannabis. The physical sign of greening out is either overdose for cannabis looks like an anxiety attack or usually stomach pains, throwing up, or some kind of experience, very uncomfortable physical symptoms. Or now my dog has a complaint. What's the problem here? Come on, you can go out. Okay, sorry. I'm a professional, y'all, don't worry. I just have to deal with my dog. The problem with the overdose is that it'll either be that mental experience or they'll experience it in their stomach. It'll look like throwing up, and that's usually when students tune into like, I should call for help, or the panic attack is when they should call for help. So I think that sense of, promoting our medical amnesty rules that we have on campus, if you're ever worried about a friend, and then with cannabis, telling them, if they're throwing up from cannabis, they had too much cannabis. And if they did it as an edible, we sometimes, remind people of this you can have unprocessed alcohol in your stomach, where we see cases where they get picked up for hospitalization, and between getting breathalyzed at the site and then at the hospital, their BAC went up. It's not because the EMT was giving them shots in the van, like they had unprocessed alcohol. This is entirely true with cannabis. It is such a slow ingestion process that if you took an edible and you're feeling sick, you probably have just get them to a place where they can be supervised. And so I think that's a helpful one. If I can, I'll just share a slide real quick, if I can do it one more time, on edible dosing, because it might be a new concept, even for some of us to be aware of that. Go back to, probably in the beginning, sorry. Edible dosing, I did have a couple slides here. We'll come to them now. I had a lot of, look at this. Went through time, and we're here now. This is actually from a cannabis site as well. This is a cannabis store in Chicago who had nice graphics, and was like, okay, students respond to nice graphics. But this is even the industry, who usually is more, hey, this is great. The industry themselves says, hey, you know what the right amount for most people is? 10 milligrams, right? So one, students don't know these numbers and it doesn't mean anything to them yet. Two, even if you have to have it available to you. So they need to be they need to know on the thing, oh, this cookie is 100 milligrams, but then 100 needs to mean something to them. 100 is too much, is probably the answer for most people. 10 is usually what's good for folks. Even the industry would say 25, if you're using more regularly, you're probably fine. Maybe you can handle 50, but even, 100 is just going to be a lot for folks. Just some things to know about with edibles, that idea of go low and start slow, or start low and go slow. Ingestion's delayed from 30 to 90 minutes, right? People are used to, right, inhaling something that's going to hit you within minutes. It's a long road when you're eating it, and this throws people off as well. That maximum effects don't hit for 2 or 3 hours. And so that's important to be aware of. And it can last from 4 to 12 hours. If you take 50, you're going to be on this journey for a while. So you should not take an edible if you're hoping to just be done with this in half an hour. Like, it's not starting for 2 hours and you're going to be in this for a while. That might be fine for some folks, but you want to plan for that. And for most users, 5 to 20 of THCA, which is the active one, it brings about the effects that they need. Just quickly, here's the problem with the size. If 5 to 20 is good for most, how many, what's a standard serving of cookies? For me, it's a Chipwich, 2 cookies with ice cream in the middle. That's probably a good starter. But they're selling cookies straight off at 100 milligrams. I was not on the internet looking for the very worst examples of these. I was dismissing anything that seemed one-off and outrageous. This is very common to find in a store that sells. 100 would be very common. 100 we know is way too much, but who thinks to break a cookie with 6 friends, right? And so same thing with chocolate bars. Let's talk about 300. Each one's 50. How would you think to break one of those into 3 parts? It's just not intuitive. And so that's a problem the industry and hopefully laws can tackle. That dosing size should be more intuitive. And we can do some education around what that means for folks too. So I'll just stop sharing again, but maybe there's more questions around that. But it's just good for us to be a little familiar with that 5 to 20 cents. Because you'll talk to students and they're often, I took 100, had no effect. An hour later, I took another 100, and then they green out.
Well, and if they're using some other form that's not edible, it's even
Yes.
harder to figure out how much the dose is.
Oh, and that's where the dabbing and other things you don't even know, and that experience can definitely happen. I will just say this, it turns out there's certainly something cumulative about THC, and there's a moment where for many people, though not all, it not only is tolerance real, and that means the effects get minimized, the good, but where it does the opposite. For everyone, overdose looks like anxiety, but there are people for whom at some point they get anxious, they start getting anxious no matter what. It seems to be that greening out can bring about that moment for people more often. So not every student who comes in greened out is going to feel like, oh, I'm getting it. But some will be like, yeah, once I started smoking again, it really wasn't the same. So that also can be a moment of thinking about intervention and having conversation, because the experience of getting high afterwards, for some will be the same, but for others will not be after having greened out.
All right, Tom, I'm going to throw one difficult question to end us here. Only because this has come up for us and I have not found an answer yet. Yeah. What can you tell us about cannabis and consent?
Yeah.
How do you tell when is somebody incapacitated? Are they incapacitated due to cannabis use?
Yeah, I appreciate this.
I know I sprung that on you.
No, because I think about this, and it's an interesting question. We ask about this in one of our surveys, and because we know alcohol can certainly does things in the brain, as Shakespeare said, it provokes and unprovokes. It provokes the desire, but takes away the ability. And I think it was Hamlet and one of those. So we know it kind of creates an environment where people are social and mixing, and we really worry about consent. This question becomes, I take it in just a few parts. One, it's really relevant to think about, but broadly, cannabis is not a large group social activity. Most people don't want to get off like, I'm gonna meet someone down at the bar or at a club or at a party. Some people will get high before. Most are like, yeah, I do not want to get high. Maybe at the end of the night or maybe a weekday, but they don't want to get high and go meet new people. They probably want to drink. And it's not everyone. So generally, it's not always in the same arena where people are most like, oh, I'm going to get drunk and get laid. But that doesn't mean that it's not happening, certainly. And so we do ask about, does cannabis make you more likely to enjoy intimacy or pursue intimacy, or less likely? And the verdict is more torn on that. Some people are like, no, I'm in my own head, like I'm not looking for that. So I think there's just that piece that one, the culture is around it's a little different, but we should still be talking about it. And I think this idea then, the other is how impaired is somebody? How would you know? How would they know? I think what we want to be is that we want to settle, it's not a high, like, or we do want a high bar. It's not, what I'm saying is we want to be very safe around our assumptions on that. And we could tell, so like, look, some people get really in their heads on this, and that's not the best time to connect. You know, this idea that sex is good simply because it's happening is not accurate. Sex is good when it's pleasurable. Sex is good, of course, it has to be consensual, but that means communication. Right. And if people can't communicate better, that's not going to go well. And so it's possible that you and a partner who know each other and have some conversation can have some amount of cannabis in your system and probably hook up with each other. We cannot, though. Two people don't know each other. Two people have no communication. You can't do it and just decide to hook up with somebody. And so I would just say that we want a very low bar on that. And if that's what you're doing for the night, that's what, smoke that night, and that's what you're doing. Or have sex and smoke after, if that's what you want to do. But don't use it. Don't take a high potency substance, impair yourself, and because people's highs are so different, and be like, oh, they're in the mood too. That's unlikely to be the case. So I just go that direction with it. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you letting me throw a difficult one at you as we're wrapping up. And if there are any other questions, we're happy to take them, but we are right at the end of time. So I want to make sure we're respectful of that. I am so grateful, Tom, for all of this work that you're doing and for sharing it with you. I put the link to the campaign in the chat for those who want to take a look, but those peer educators have given out about 60 copies of the Tea Break book in the last 3 weeks. And honestly, we're not giving them out, they're not the fun things. We have fun things to give out.
Yeah, right.
This is people taking one off the table. Yeah, it's not the Pop It or the other things. It's people taking them because they want them. So I think that's really cool. And so applause to our peer educators for doing that work, and thank you for sharing so that we have some idea of what we're doing with that tolerance break.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be back at any point. And if people have questions, let me throw it in here. It's just tom.fontana@uvm.edu. So follow up. The Tea Break Guide's available online. You can print it out. It's just a free resource, and it's not branded. It's not UVM. It's not my name. It's just I have an introduction where I say my name, but it's not like any school can use it. You're welcome to, and so please. But if you have any questions, reach out. And then, hey, let's do a thing about the psychedelic topic sometime, and that for another day. But I appreciate you hosting these conversations and having them. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you. And we will put the recording on our YouTube channels for folks if you want to refer back to it or use it for anything. And then we will see you again May something, the first Thursday in May, and we're going to be given an update from our folks across the university talking about some of the numbers and information from this past year, and hope to do a hybrid session in the Russell House. So hope folks can join us either on Zoom or in person. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Bye. See ya. Thanks, y'all.